So, back when Age of Empires 4 released in 2021, many of us were super excited at all the new possibilities that this new game could bring. It had been many years since the release of Age of Empires 3, which personally is my most beloved Age of Empires game if you have not seen my other videos and social media posts which cover it. Yet, what came with AoE 4 was what appeared to be an entirely refreshed and updated take on the classic strategy series. Now I feel plenty would agree that AoE 4 comes off much more like a direct sequel to Age of Empires 2, taking things back to the medieval ages, but I was also happy to see other little elements which were still carried over from Age of Empires 3. And although there is a ton to love about Age of Empires 4, with solid gameplay, fun progression, interesting campaigns, unique civilizations to master, and overall a gorgeous presentation, one of my biggest complaints was the content drought the game fell into for a while. At launch, the game only came with 8 playable civilizations, and although they covered pretty much the core of what you'd expect, ranging from England and France to Russia and China, they did leave a bit to be desired, and it would take quite a long time before any major significant updates would come out, ones which brought either new civilizations or campaigns. Namely for me, a Japanese faction, being that obviously pre-modern Japan is my main focus and interest. Now I know that might have not been at the top of everyone's priority list, and I know that when the game came out that yes, they already gave us still quite a bit of flavor. But with my own interest in Japan and with every other Age of Empires game coming with the Japanese faction at least some point through DLC, I was bummed that we did not get it from the start right here in AoE 4. I even made a meme about it when the game first came out. I was disappointed when, after like a year of waiting, the first release of new factions only brought the Ottomans and the Malians. Which I know the Ottomans were very sought after, but Mali did come off as a bit random. By this point though, I had really lost most of my faith in AoE 4 and had returned completely to AoE 3 Definitive Edition. However, eventually another year passed and finally word came out that Japan was coming, as screenshots leaked of new Japanese architecture. But what was odd was that we'd soon discover that yes, the Japanese were on their way, but they were going to be released in the new DLC titled The Sultan's Ascend. And not just that, but that they were also going to be coming with the Byzantines too. The whole concept is just strange. Why are the Japanese coming out in an expansion that from the outside seems like it has nothing to do with them? It doesn't make any sense. And sadly, what this also meant was that since the Japanese, or East Asia for that matter, was not the main focal point of this DLC, was that there was unfortunately not going to be any new campaign for the Japanese, instead just adding in one focused on the Middle East. What this leads to is the entire Japanese faction feeling just a bit tacked on, added because the developers simply felt it was time rather than actually putting in the time and effort into doing it in a proper way. It's a far cry from games like Age of Empires 3, which did come out with really great campaigns for all the Asian civilizations, who got an entire expansion just devoted to Asia. I actually made a whole video just about Japan's awesome campaign in AoE 3, which goes through the events leading up to the Battle of Sekigahara. Yet with the campaigns in AoE 4 being so high polished and with great and informative cutscenes, it's just gutting that we did not get any of that for Japan. I was really hoping for it. In fact, even when you look at the masteries for the Japanese faction, which are challenges that give rewards for doing certain things in the game, they didn't even put any time or effort into adding fun facts about Japan like they did for every other civ before this DLC. So it's safe to say that I'm already a bit upset about the state of things, even before jumping into a game as the Japanese. So, let's do that now. Let's dive in. Are the Japanese actually any good? Is there any great fun to be had? Well, of course there is. The Japanese are actually a blast to play, and there's a lot to enjoy. Now, each civilization in AoE 4 sort of covers a date range which depicts them over time. For the Japanese, we start in the late 700s and end things in the early 1600s. So we have a lot of ground to cover. But I love the way that the game illustrates this. Earlier units will start with earlier period armor. We see Oyeroi and Domaru, but eventually as you go on you will update things to pave the way for more modern styles such as the Tosegosoku. You see samurai becoming more heavily armored killing machines, and foot soldiers becoming the more standardized Ashigaru of the Sengoku Jidai. The architecture is also really fun to see advance, as through time you eventually start to see more higher uses of stone as time progresses. In fact, visually, how your town changes over time is one of AoE 4's greatest features, I think, because there's really just so much that goes into the tiny aesthetic details on display. Now, one of the key ways the Japanese function is by continually buffing out the effectiveness of their military units. They get unique techs that do this, but even more focus is put onto your bannermen, Each type of military unit, from infantry to ranged to cavalry, comes with their own unique elite bannermen that buff all surrounding units of that classification. Bannermen themselves have a cap, a limit that can be increased through building and upgrading your town centers, which instead for the Japanese act as daimyo manors. Japan also have some other really interesting features, like being able to choose between religions. Now, initially you might be thinking, what would you be choosing between, Buddhism or Christianity, being that the spread of Christianity in Japan did occur during the Sengoku period? Actually, no, you are choosing between Buddhism and Shinto, which feels really odd. Throughout pre-modern Japan, the line between Shinto and Buddhism was a bit blurred. The Japanese back then, and even up to this very day, usually practice a combination of beliefs from both. This has led to some simply labeling religion in pre-modern Japan as Shinto Buddhism. The real official separation between the two did not come until the Meiji Restoration in the late 1800s, so it's odd here that we have to pick between the two. Now, from what I can tell, picking the Shinto option is the better and more unique of the two, as with Shinto you continually get access to relics that can be used to buff out some of your buildings. This is not the case with Buddhism, which I believe just functions more as a standard religion option that other civs get. And I think this is a great segue into talking about many of the other strange decisions they decided to make, both in terms of perhaps balance and as well as just odd things historically. And I know this might sound a lot like nitpicking, but that's sort of what I'm supposed to do here after all. On a lesser scale, there are some odd things we have to wait for depending on the age we are in. It's strange that we can build samurai infantry in the Dark Ages but not mounted samurai, specifically when the fact remains that when the samurai first emerged, they were seen as mounted archers. There is also the odd fact that you can't build castles in the Castle Age as the Japanese and instead have to wait for the Imperial Age. I imagine there is some balancing reason behind this, but it is still pretty weird. There is also some strangeness when it comes to weapons and other unit model details. Samurai, accurately enough, start with a naginata and not a sword like a tachi, but later you can update them to using an odachi or nodachi, which does feel a bit off, especially when the odachi was intended as more of an anti-cavalry weapon, while the stat increase the game gives it is one which buffs the unit against other infantry. There is also a major red flag when it comes to cavalry. The problem here comes in regarding the fact that for some weird reason they decided to portray both the horsemen and mounted samurai units as having small circular shields. To my knowledge, there's nothing like this that ever existed in pre-modern Japan, besides the fact that samurai cavalry didn't even use shields. This just comes off more looking like a simple reskinned version of other units already in the game. Like whoever was creating the unit model for these units simply forgot to remove the shield from the model. I hope this is just a quick fix that the developers are able to make, as all they really need to do is just go in and just remove the shields from the unit model. Another odd choice, which just feels like something that they did not bother to update or adjust, is the fact that they did not turn the hand cannon units into proper matchlock armed ashigaru. They already have the correct unit model, they just decided to give them the old hand cannon weapon that all other hand cannon units get, which just comes off as looking a bit funky. Not that Japan did not use these older style hand cannons. They actually did use something very similar from China for a time. However, when this unit is so clearly meant to represent soldiers from the later years of the Sengoku Jidai armed with firearms, it just comes off as looking strange. They do, however, have a really cool new unit they added in with the Tanegashima Gunsmith, which acts as a single-man artillery unit that you can produce in mass thanks to the side effect of the Gunsmith landmark. However, with all these minor gripes regarding presentation, I have no issue with the fact that these units are in the game. They all make perfect sense in my opinion. However, there are some other units which, although systematically make sense, are also a tad more historically questionable. This being the high reliance on female warriors, and of course the shinobi unit. Now, for female warriors, we see two specific units added in, an infantry unit and a ranged cavalry unit. And I just want to be clear that once again, I'm not saying that systematically they do not have their place in the Japanese roster. Both units are great and sorely needed. My question comes in with why did the developers feel the need to put in so many female warriors in the first place, when these units could have easily been made male and given different names? This is where we have to look more into the real history behind it. Female warriors in Japan, although yes, they definitely existed, were also very rare, and many of the stories we have of them have been highly embellished and even in some cases perhaps outright fictitious. I've made a whole video on this topic. And I'm not saying there not should be some representation with perhaps at least one female warrior unit, but 2 just feels a bit excessive when historically they played such a minor role. It would be like adding an entire new female knight into the French civilization just because Joan of Arc existed. It makes me feel like the developers were trying harder to play too heavily into niche but highly popular and romanticized elements of pre-modern Japan rather than trying to stay more accurate. But that's not the only historically questionable decision when it comes to the Japanese roster. Another big one comes in with the shinobi units you can get access to through the Koka Village Age 1 advancement. Now this one I don't necessarily consider to be too bad, although it does play into another false romanticized idea that has arisen over the years. This being the concept of the ninja. For the 1000th time, no, there were not really villagers who dressed in all black like this who would run around assassinating and sabotaging things. In reality, it seems that the shinobi, as the game more accurately calls them, were actually more part of the samurai class and operated as scouts or agents of espionage either within enemy territory or within armies. I think including them was perhaps inevitable given their popularity, but I'm just glad to see that they did not go too overboard with them, really only making them a factor if you decide to build that landmark. Now I could go on and on talking about the rest of the roster, but these are the things that really stood out to me that I felt I needed to touch on. Yes, the Japanese do come with a host of other generic artillery units that mostly all other civilizations can get, and although they can get some cool ships for naval games, I've never been the biggest fan of water maps, so I did not really mess around with this too much. So what would my final thoughts be on the Japanese in Age of Empires 4? Well, although there is still plenty of fun to be had with them, and of course I could nitpick the roster for what is historically accurate and inaccurate to no end, I think the biggest thing for me is just that I am more disappointed with how they were introduced. I was really hoping we would see some larger Asian-focused expansion, similar to the Asian Dynasties expansion that came to Age of Empires 3. I was hoping it would bring a whole host of new Asian civilizations, including the Japanese, and also of course give Japan their own unique campaign. Instead, they just feel misplaced and tacked on, given to us more because the developers probably felt it was about time, rather than actually caring about putting more effort into a better themed expansion for them and other Asian civilizations. The simple fact that they came up with a more Middle Eastern themed DLC with no new campaign for the Japanese, no cool fun facts included in their masteries, and with no other Asian civilizations is just a letdown. And I think it also speaks to a wider problem I have with AoE 4. Being that, as a whole, despite all it has going for it as one of the best looking and polished Age of Empires games, I still feel it comes off much lesser as an overall experience when compared to AoE 2 and AoE 3. Now, yes, I know that those games have had much more time to accumulate new content, but right now, as of 2023, when making this video, AoE 4 would not be my go-to, as myself and most other players I play with strongly favor AoE 3 Definitive Edition with all its new great content and quality of life improvements they have added to that already fantastic game to make it even better. And I know there is even more love out there for AoE 2, which remains the most played game in the series. I hope one day that AoE 4 can get the time and attention it deserves, and specifically for the Japanese faction to get more fleshed out content in terms of a campaign and other fun features. But as of right now, I can't see myself playing this for too long. But what are your thoughts? Do you enjoy AoE 4? Have you tried out the new Japanese faction yet? What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. And with that said, thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most interesting.